The story of America's underwater demolition teams begins not with triumph, but with catastrophe. It begins on the blood-soaked shores of Tarawa on November 20th, 1943, when the Pacific sun rose over the atoll and exposed the terrible miscalculations that would ignite the birth of a new kind of warrior. The invasion planners had believed that high tide would allow the landing craft to glide smoothly over the coral reefs, bringing Marines safely to shore. But the tides betrayed them. As the Higgins boats drove forward, their hulls scraped coral and stuck fast, suspended on natural barriers that had not been fully charted. Marines were forced to abandon their landing craft and wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water, rifles held high above their heads, while Japanese defenders, well-entrenched, patient, and merciless, opened fire with machine guns from concealed positions. Men fell into the water, their ammunition soaked, their bodies riddled with bullets, before they even reached the beach. The tide turned red. Radio reports were grim. Officers watching from offshore stared in disbelief, horror, and anger. And from the carnage emerged a realization that would reshape amphibious warfare forever. If America was to continue its push across the Pacific, someone had to go in first. Before the Marines, before the landing craft, before the battle even began, someone had to clear the way. From that need, born out of agony and loss, came the first conceptual spark of the underwater demolition teams. Commodore Kelly Turner and Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner recognized the urgency immediately. Admiral Chester Nimitz, shaken by the slaughter at Tarawa, approved the creation of specialized groups capable of conducting hydrographic reconnaissance and clearing beach obstacles. And for leadership, the Navy turned to a man uniquely qualified, uniquely hardened by experience, and uniquely capable of shaping such a unit. Lieutenant Commander Draper Lawrence Kaufman. Kaufman's story was already legend in certain circles. Rejected from the U.S. Naval Academy because of poor eyesight, he had refused to accept defeat. Instead, he joined the American Field Service at the outbreak of World War II, driving ambulances under fire in France, and later volunteering for the British Royal Navy's bomb disposal teams during the Blitz. He had defused unexploded bombs in burning buildings, in rubble-filled streets, and in smoking craters that still trembled with the echo of explosions. His courage and steady hands earned him the respect of British officers and a deep familiarity with high explosives, knowledge that would soon prove vital. When he returned to the United States, the Navy finally accepted him, and by 1943 he was placed in charge of the Naval Combat Demolition Units. At Waimanalo Amphibious Training Base in Hawaii, Kaufman gathered a group of volunteers, men from the Seabees, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. Some had engineering backgrounds. Others were simply natural swimmers, unafraid of the ocean. Many had no idea what they were signing up for. What they all shared was one characteristic: a willingness to attempt the impossible. Kaufman subjected them to a training regimen that bordered on the inhuman. The days began before sunrise. Men sprinted across beaches with soft sand that swallowed their feet. They paddled heavy rubber boats until their arms burned. They ran obstacle courses designed to punish the faint-hearted. And most importantly, they lived in the surf, pounded by waves, chilled by cold water, cut by coral, forced to perform long-distance swims again and again until exhaustion blurred their vision. The ocean became their crucible. Explosives became their tools. Fear became their constant shadow, but one they learned to ignore. The gear was primitive by modern standards. The men had no wetsuits, no scuba tanks, no advanced masks. They swam nearly naked, clad only in swim trunks, fins, and dive masks. Sometimes they carried only waterproof slates, grease pencils, and explosives strapped to their bodies. Their skin burned under the sun and blistered under the salt. But they adapted, they innovated, and through suffering, they became something new in American military history.
Their first real combat deployment came at Kwajalein Atoll in January 1944. The mission: swim ahead of the landing craft, measure depths, locate reefs, and mark safe approaches. As the men slid into the water, they embarked on a mission unlike any ever attempted by the U.S. Navy. They swam silently toward enemy-held beaches, vulnerable to artillery, machine guns, and the unpredictable ocean. Yet they completed the reconnaissance flawlessly. Their charts allowed the invasion force to land with far fewer casualties than Tarawa. Word began to spread through the fleet. These demolition swimmers were something extraordinary. By mid-1944, their value was undeniable. The UDTs expanded. Teams 1 through 7 formed, each undergoing brutal training and preparing for missions that grew more ambitious with every island. At Saipan in June 1944, the UDTs swam under fire, bullets slicing the water around them. Ensign Lewis Howard later described swimming while hearing the buzzing crack of rounds passing inches from his head. He wrote on his waterproof slate with steady hands, even as explosions sent jets of water skyward around him. Then came Tinian, a small island with beaches that planners deemed unsuitable for landings. The Japanese expected the Americans to attack the obvious southern beaches, but UDT swimmers, exploring the northern coastline at great personal risk, discovered narrow, less defended approaches that the Japanese had overlooked. Their discovery altered the invasion plan. Marines stormed ashore through these unexpected lanes and secured the island with remarkable speed. Without the UDTs, the battle could have been far bloodier. But the Japanese learned. At Guam and Peleliu, they concentrated fire on the water, recognizing the threat posed by these seemingly bare-chested swimmers. UDT men were now seen as high-value targets. During the reconnaissance of Peleliu, swimmers saw Japanese soldiers watching them from bunkers. Sometimes the enemy fired, sometimes they stared in confusion, unable to comprehend why Americans were calmly swimming toward them in open water. But confusion or not, the danger was constant. Peleliu's coral shredded flesh. Explosive charges could misfire. The heat was unbearable. Currents threatened to pull men out to sea. Yet mission after mission, the teams pressed forward. Then came the crucible of crucibles, Iwo Jima. February 17, 1945. 2 days before the main invasion. Mount Suribachi loomed like a dark dagger against the sky. The Japanese were entrenched in a labyrinth of bunkers, pillboxes, and underground tunnels. They had spent years fortifying the island. The UDT's task was brutally simple: survey the beaches, destroy obstacles, and prepare the way for the Marines. As they approached in landing craft, Japanese artillery opened fire. Several craft were destroyed outright, exploding into plumes of fire and smoke. Bodies tumbled into the surf. Those who survived jumped into the water and swam forward, even as bullets snapped past them. Lieutenant Junior Grade Ted Robinson later described swimming while hearing the underwater flashes from their demolition charges and tracer fire stitching the waves above him. He could hear the distinct metallic hiss of rounds passing close by. Yet the swimmers continued their work with terrifying calmness, driven by training and duty. By the end of the day, over 24 UDT personnel were killed or wounded, their highest single-day losses of the war. But they had cleared the way. The Marines landed. The battle began. And still, the UDTs continued. Okinawa became their final major amphibious challenge of the war. They swam through mined waters, through coral forests, through shifting currents, and through areas where Japanese forces waited in caves. Sometimes the enemy did not shoot, sometimes they did. The swimmers never knew what awaited them under the surface or behind a reef. Yet they did their work, mapping the coastlines meticulously, ensuring the invasion force could land safely. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the UDTs had conducted operations in nearly every major amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. They had revolutionized naval warfare. They had shown that the ocean was not an obstacle, it was a pathway. And yet, they were not done. Korea erupted in 1950. The UDTs deployed again, conducting reconnaissance, sabotage, mine clearing, and clandestine operations along the coastline. They rode submarines, inserted at night, planted charges on bridges, scouted enemy harbors, and assisted in the famous Incheon landing under General Douglas MacArthur. Incheon's tides were notoriously extreme, more than 30 feet of tidal variation. The UDTs charted them, marked safe channels, and ensured landing craft did not run aground. Without their work, the landing could have failed. Once again, they proved indispensable. But as the Cold War unfolded, new challenges arose. Guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency, covert operations. The UDTs were unmatched in the water, but warfare was evolving. The Navy recognized the need for a broader, more flexible special operations capability. And so, in 1962, under the direction of President John F. Kennedy, SEAL Team 1 and SEAL Team 2 were formed. Many of their founding members came directly from the UDTs. The skills, traditions, and culture of the UDTs flowed directly into the SEAL community.
Yet the legacy of the underwater demolition teams did not end with their transformation into SEALs. To understand how deeply they influence modern special operations, one must understand not only what they accomplished, but who they were. Ordinary men who willingly entered extraordinary danger with almost no recognition. Many were young, barely out of high school, drawn to the ocean or fascinated by the idea of serving in a unique capacity. Others were seasoned sailors and engineers who had spent years on ships or in workshops before volunteering. Some were athletes, swimmers, water polo players, divers, who saw the UDTs as a perfect match for their skills. A few were simply thrill seekers, men who had spent their youth pushing limits and now sought a greater challenge in wartime. What united them was an unwavering devotion to their team, a bond forged by shared suffering, mutual trust, and the knowledge that failure in their missions could cost thousands of lives. Their training environment on Oahu was a place where the human spirit was pushed until it bent or broke or hardened into something unshakable. The men lived in simple huts near the beach, the ocean always a few steps away. The sound of waves became the soundtrack of their lives. They practiced day after day, swimming miles in the open ocean, diving beneath the surf to simulate reconnaissance, experimenting with homemade flotation devices and improvised tools, learning how to place explosives precisely on coral heads or wooden stakes. They worked with TNT blocks, primacord, blasting caps and time pencils, tools that demanded respect. A moment's carelessness could cost fingers, eyes, or lives. Kaufman drilled into them a sense of controlled fear, teaching them that nerves could be managed, that explosive work demanded calm minds, and that the ocean, while dangerous, could be mastered with enough experience. Their missions were often executed in darkness, long before any American soldier approached the shore. They rode in landing craft infantry, LCIs, or smaller rubber boats, engines humming softly, sometimes escorted by destroyers or patrol boats scanning the surface for threats. The moment came when they had to slip quietly into the water. The sea felt cold even in tropical climates, the darkness thick, the bottom invisible. They swam using side strokes or breaststrokes, conserving energy and avoiding splashes. Underwater, the world became a muted echo chamber. Their own breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Some men later recalled that the ocean amplified their heartbeat, making it seem impossible that the enemy did not hear them approaching. They carried slates attached to their wrists or clipped to their belts, writing notes as they swam: depth readings, sand composition, coral formations, locations of obstacles. They used weighted lines to measure the ocean floor and mark channels with buoys or lights. If obstacles needed to be destroyed, they attached charges underwater, using rope, clamps, or hand-tied knots. They often worked in sight of Japanese defenders who waited silently in bunkers, sometimes holding fire to avoid revealing their positions, sometimes shooting suddenly without warning. The swimmers learned not to panic at the first crack of gunfire. They learned to push forward, complete the mission, and withdraw only after confirming their work was done. One of the most remarkable aspects of the UDTs was their adaptability. At Guam, the coral reefs were massive and jagged, threatening to rip open landing craft hulls. At Saipan, the currents were unpredictable and strong enough to sweep swimmers off course if they weren't careful. At Tinian, the cliffs at the edges of the island forced swimmers into narrow approaches. At Peleliu, the water was so clear that Japanese snipers could see swimmers moving beneath the surface. At Iwo Jima, visibility was poor, and volcanic ash made the water murky like a black curtain. No two islands were alike. No two missions repeated the same pattern. The UDTs had to be flexible thinkers, capable of adjusting plans on the fly, improvising solutions, and making decisions under extreme pressure.
Their pre-assault reconnaissance before Iwo Jima was among the most dangerous missions performed by any American unit in the Pacific. The Japanese defenders had zero tolerance for intrusions. They had spent months observing American tactics and knew that pre-invasion swimmers often preceded amphibious landings. The shoreline was saturated with machine gun nests, artillery positions, and hidden mortar tubes. As UDT swimmers approached, explosives detonated underwater while shells crashed around them. The ocean itself became a battlefield, the water erupting into white fountains as rounds struck. Men dove beneath the surface for protection, their lungs burning as they tried to stay down long enough to avoid gunfire. Despite the ferocity of enemy resistance, the swimmers completed their reconnaissance. They measured every critical detail of the beaches the Marines would land on: slope grade, sand firmness, depth changes, reef formations, submerged rocks. They identified where tanks might get stuck, where landing craft could safely approach, where obstacles lurked beneath the waves. Their charts became essential for invasion planners, and officers later acknowledged that the Marines' ability to storm the beaches depended heavily on the accuracy of UDT measurements. This pattern repeated across multiple islands, the quiet, unseen work of swimmers deciding the fate of invasions before the first rifle shot was fired. The UDTs also played a crucial role in pioneering explosive techniques. They developed new methods of placing charges underwater and experimented with different detonation patterns. One of the most distinctive innovations was the use of Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosives that could be inserted under obstacles on land or in shallow water. They also created daisy chains of TNT blocks strung together with primacord, allowing multiple charges to detonate simultaneously. Engineers within the teams discovered that certain coral formations responded better to shaped charges than to blunt blasts, leading to more efficient clearing methods that reduced the risk of debris injuring the swimmers. The bonds between team members strengthened through shared hardship. Veteran swimmers recalled nights when they returned to camp exhausted, bodies bruised from coral, hands blistered from rowing, legs trembling from hours in the water. They shared stories over simple meals, laughed at near disasters, and mourned the loss of comrades who had been killed or wounded. They patched each other's wounds, helped each other carry heavy boats, and offered encouragement when someone reached the edge of giving up. Their camaraderie became a defining feature of the UDT culture, carried forward decades later into the SEAL teams, where brotherhood remains a guiding principle. One of the most widely respected UDT leaders was Lieutenant Commander John T. McCloy, a former sailor who had earned 2 Medals of Honor before joining the demolition community. His presence inspired confidence. Men serving under him knew that he led from the front, willing to face the same dangers they did. His calm demeanor under fire and ability to rally swimmers during chaotic missions made him a legend within the teams. Another figure, Ensign Jack Taylor, became one of the most remarkable UDT members of the war. After serving with Underwater Demolition Team 3, Taylor later joined the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, Maritime Unit, conducting secret missions in the Mediterranean. His exploits included infiltration, sabotage, reconnaissance, and rescuing downed airmen, operations that foreshadowed the clandestine nature of future SEAL missions. Captured by the Gestapo and sent to Mauthausen concentration camp, Taylor survived the ordeal and later testified against Nazi war criminals. His legacy connected the UDTs not only to the SEALs, but to the entire world of modern special operations. Throughout the Pacific, UDTs worked with other branches of the military, Marines, Army engineers, and Seabees, to ensure that amphibious landings were coordinated and efficient. They often briefed officers using maps drawn hours earlier, while still dripping wet from the ocean. Their expertise became so valued that Marines frequently referred to them as the first heroes of an invasion, the men who cleared the path so others could fight on more equal terms. When the war ended, many UDT veterans returned home quietly, their contributions overlooked. The public knew little about them. Newspapers rarely mentioned their missions due to wartime secrecy. The men themselves were modest, downplaying their achievements. Some returned to construction, fishing, engineering, or civilian diving jobs. Others remained in the Navy, continuing to refine demolition and swimming techniques in preparation for future conflicts. Their moment came again in the Korean War. When North Korea invaded the South in 1950, the UDTs were activated for operations along the coastline. They conducted night raids, reconnaissance missions, and harbor infiltrations. They planted explosives under enemy supply routes, mapped tides for amphibious landings, and cleared mines in treacherous waters. During the famous Incheon landing, notorious for its extreme tidal variations and muddy shallows, the UDTs surveyed the area and marked channels for landing craft. Their charts were vital for the success of MacArthur's bold plan, which turned the tide of the war. Korea also introduced the UDTs to new environments, freezing winters, icy waters, and rugged coastlines unlike anything in the Pacific. They adapted once more. They learned to operate from submarines, paddling small boats in darkness before slipping into frigid water. They trained for stealth missions, reconnaissance behind enemy lines, and operations that required silence and precision. This evolution laid the groundwork for their future transformation. As the Cold War deepened, global tension shifted. The U.S. military needed forces capable of conducting unconventional warfare, counterinsurgency, and covert operations. President John F. Kennedy recognized this need and called for a new generation of elite warriors. From the heritage of the UDTs came the Navy SEALs, who combined the demolition swimmers' mastery of the ocean with new skills, parachuting, close-quarters combat, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla tactics. Yet SEAL Moans have always acknowledged that the spirit of their teams was inherited directly from the men who swam bare-chested into machine gun fire during World War II. Even today, SEAL candidates undergo Hell Week, a brutal period of non-stop physical and mental strain, directly descended from Draper Kaufman's World War II-era training program. The cold surf, the sleepless nights, the physical exhaustion, all of it echoes the experiences of the first UDT volunteers who learned that hardship was the foundation of strength. Though technology has advanced, the core principles remain unchanged: courage, teamwork, adaptability, and absolute commitment to the mission. Every SEAL operator knows that their lineage traces back to young men who swam through reefs under enemy fire, wearing only fins and determination. The story of the underwater demolition teams is not simply a tale of wartime innovation. It is the story of human resilience, of evolution through necessity, of bravery born from tragedy and refined through relentless challenge. It is the story of men who embraced the unknown, ventured into hostile waters, and laid the foundation for one of the most formidable special operations forces in the world.
The first demolition men believed that Saipan had been brutal, but Tinian would reveal even more of the psychological pressure that came with their new kind of warfare. The Japanese defenders had chosen to fortify Tinian with deceptive terrain. Beautiful beaches masking underwater traps designed to tear Higgins boats apart before Marines could storm ashore. Admiral Kelly Turner wanted a perfect landing site, and Draper Kaufman's teams were ordered to find one. It meant one thing: another daylight reconnaissance under fire. On the morning of July 24, 1944, the sun glared white over Tinian's palm-lined coast as UDT-5 and UDT-7 slipped off their support craft. The coral here was sharper than at Saipan, jutting like spears upward from the ocean floor. Kaufman had warned them, "Move slow, breathe, the ocean listens." But the ocean did more than listen. It carried sound like a drum, and when the first Japanese machine gun burst cracked from the cliffs, every diver flinched as if the sea itself had exploded. The swimmers spread out, legs fluttering in soft frog kicks, each man's canvas bag dragging with wooden stakes to mark shallow regions. Lieutenant Christ, already a legend among the men for his calm under pressure, plunged deeper to verify a channel depth, while bullets punched the water around him like violent raindrops. Above him, the support LCPRs fired suppressive rounds, columns of water erupting as shells struck. Some Japanese guns shifted to the boats, and suddenly, a direct hit ignited one of the LCPRs. The entire craft erupted in a column of flame. Men in the water heard screams from the deck, raw, agonized sound, but they could not break formation. Their job came first. "Stay on task," someone muttered through clenched teeth. "Mark the reef." When Christ surfaced, he found two swimmers dragging a wounded man, his shoulder split open where shrapnel had bitten through flesh. Blood spiraled around them in the water like red ribbons. Christ grabbed the man's other arm and said the only thing he could: "Almost there. Don't you quit on me." A mortar shell exploded just yards away, the shock waves slamming into them with the force of a hammer. They were thrown beneath the surface, ears ringing, lungs burning. Christ forced himself back up, sucking in air and scanning for the beach. The Japanese still fired relentlessly, but he also heard a distant droning, American naval guns beginning their bombardment. Shells from battleships screamed overhead and slammed into Tinian's cliffs, turning whole segments into avalanches of dust and rock. In that moment, between incoming fire and the relentless task of marking the reef, the UDT swimmers understood something new about their role. They were not simply paving the way for Marines. They were the point of the spear, the men who would decide whether thousands lived or died during the landing.
Inch by inch, mark by mark, they mapped the seafloor. Only when their bags were empty did they give the signal to pull back. The withdrawal was chaos again. Machine gun fire still hammered the waves, and one swimmer was struck directly in the leg, cartilage and bone splitting apart. Another man dove beneath the surface, grabbed him under the arms, and dragged him out by sheer force of will. When they finally moved out of range, silence settled around them, broken only by their desperate breathing. That night, aboard the USS Gilmer, the men reviewed the landing map they had created. Every coral head, every sandbar, every depth measured with precision. Admiral Turner looked at it, nodded once, and said, "Gentlemen, because of this, Marines will get ashore." It was the kind of praise the UDT rarely received, but it meant everything. The invasion of Tinian was one of the most flawless amphibious assaults of the Pacific War, largely because of their work. Yet even in triumph, the teams knew worse would come. The closer American forces pushed toward Japan, the more desperate and fanatical the defenders became. And the next great battle, the one the Marines feared, the one every demolition man whispered about, was Iwo Jima. As UDT units prepared to depart the Marianas, they trained relentlessly on volcanic sand, knowing the beaches of Iowa would be black and steep. They practiced explosive setup drills in the dark, dove through rough surf, and studied aerial photographs of the island of Sulphur, the smoking fortress dominated by Mount Suribachi. The intelligence briefings were grim: an unknown number of mines, wooden stakes, tetrahedrons, steel obstacles, and a labyrinth of tunnels. Nearly 20,000 Japanese troops entrenched with orders to fight to the death. Kaufman addressed his men on the deck of the USS Blessman before deployment. "I won't lie to you, Iwo Jima will be hell, but if the Marines are going, then we go first." The men nodded. Some smoked, some checked their dive knives, some simply stared out at the horizon, thinking of home. On February 17, 1945, 2 days before the Marines would land, the UDTs approached the shores of Iwo Jima. The ocean here was hotter, full of volcanic ash that made the water cloudy and bitter to taste. The Japanese guns, perfectly hidden in fortified positions, stayed eerily silent at first. This silence terrified them more than open fire. Lieutenant Commander E.D. Doc Kaiser whispered, "They're waiting, holding fire until we're close." As the swimmers advanced, the Japanese finally struck. Explosions erupted from hidden artillery, machine guns raked the waves, and mortars blossomed around the boats. One direct hit struck the USS Blessman, killing and injuring dozens. Flames devoured the deck, but the men in the water kept moving. They had no choice. The assault waves depended on the intelligence they collected. Swimmer Edward Butch Voris later described the scene: "The water boiled around us. Every second I thought it would be me, but you keep going. You have to keep going." Men dived and resurfaced, drove wooden stakes into the sand, measured depths as bullets chewed the water inches from their skulls. One team leader shouted for his men to stay low, but a stray machine gun burst cut across the surface and struck him in the neck. Blood fanned out in a bright, warm cloud. 2 swimmers pulled him back, but he died before they reached the boat. Still, their job continued. Still, they swam forward. Still, they marked obstacles. By the time they returned to the fleet, the deck was lined with wounded. Some men collapsed from exhaustion. Others vomited seawater and adrenaline. And yet their charts, the hand-sketched maps marked under fire, would save thousands of Marines during the invasion that followed on February 19, 1945. The battle for Iwo Jima raged for a month, one of the bloodiest in American history. The UDT swimmers watched from offshore as the flag was raised atop Suribachi, knowing their silent work had played a part in that moment. But there was barely time to breathe. The invasion of Okinawa, Operation Iceberg, was approaching, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and the demolition teams would once again be called to the front. As they sailed toward Okinawa, the men knew this would not be like the others. The Japanese still fought with fury, but now they introduced a new terror: kamikaze attacks. Every day brought more suicide planes diving directly into American ships. At night, the ocean glowed with burning oil as crippled vessels smoldered across the horizon. The UDT swimmers slept in their boots, weapons within reach, because alarms could sound at any moment, and often did. One night, while UDT-4 was reviewing reconnaissance notes, a siren wailed. A kamikaze bomber screamed out of the clouds and plunged toward the USS Stanley. The explosion tore a hole in the ship's starboard side and sent a rain of metal across the deck. Demolition men rushed to aid the wounded while fires roared around them. This was a new kind of warfare, no longer just the sea, but the sky itself hunting them. When the swimmers finally entered Okinawa's waters, they faced heavy surf, Japanese artillery, underwater mines, and the ever-present threat of sniper fire from concealed cliffs. Yet they performed their duties with relentless determination. On one reconnaissance, a group of swimmers discovered an unexpected minefield closer to shore than intelligence had predicted. Had the Marines landed there, Dozens of boats would have detonated instantly. The UDT marked every position, then returned after nightfall to clear as many mines as they could with small charges. They worked silently, knowing that even one mistake meant death. Their mission contributed directly to the successful landing of the 10th Army. But the battle for Okinawa dragged on for months. Rain fell endlessly, turning everything to mud. UDT men who returned to their ships read casualty reports with hollow eyes. They had survived yet another landing, but many of their fellow sailors and Marines had not. When Okinawa finally fell, the demolition teams had completed the last major amphibious reconnaissance of the war. They were exhausted, battered, and in many cases emotionally numb. Yet they had changed warfare. What began as a desperate experiment in 1943 had evolved into a distinct combat force. Men trained to handle explosives, reconnaissance, combat swimming, and survival under relentless fire. The UDTs had paved the way for a new kind of warrior, and though they didn't yet know it, their legacy would grow into something even greater: the future Navy SEALs.
When the guns finally fell silent over Okinawa, the men of the underwater demolition teams felt a strange emptiness settle over them, a quiet that felt more dangerous than the thunder that had defined their lives for nearly 2 years. The war was clearly nearing its end, but no one aboard the American fleet dared to relax. Rumors spread through the ships, rumors that the next operation would be the invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, an amphibious assault so massive that planners estimated up to 1 million American casualties. And if that day came, the demolition men knew they would once again be the first into the water, the first to test the traps, the first to be shot at, the first to fall. And Japan itself, they were told, would be defended far more fiercely than Saipan, Tinian, or even Iwo Jima. Draper Kaufman gathered his men on deck one evening, the air heavy with the smell of diesel, salt, and tropical rain. He looked at them, sunburned, scarred, some limping, all exhausted, and he told them the truth. If we invade Japan, the casualties will be beyond anything we've seen. The beaches will be mined, the waters will be trapped. They will defend every inch. Be ready, because they will send us in first. Men exchanged glances. Some clenched their jaws. Some nodded without expression. They had been first into hell before. They would do it again. But deep down, many wondered whether they could survive another landing like Iwo Jima. In mid-1945, the UDTs trained harder than ever. Longer swims, more explosives, night operations, shallow water clearance drills under live fire. They experimented with new rebreathers, new fins, new demolition charges, new reconnaissance techniques. Every lesson learned and every blood-soaked landing across the Pacific was folded into their evolving doctrine. But then, the world shifted. On August 6th, a single bomber dropped a weapon unlike anything humanity had ever unleashed. Hiroshima vanished in white fire. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. A week after, Imperial Japan surrendered. For the first time in years, the men of the UDT teams felt something like disbelief. No massive final landing, no suicidal Japanese defense of their homeland, no more black sand beaches drenched in blood. The war was over, and yet, for the demolition men, there was no celebration, only silence. Some cried. Some stared at the ocean. Some simply sat on the deck, letting the news sink in with the weight of lives spared. They returned home as part of a Navy that barely understood what they had accomplished. Most Americans had never heard of the underwater demolition teams. Newspapers wrote about the Marines who raised the flag on Suribachi, the soldiers who liberated Europe, the pilots who struck Japan. The men who swam into machine gun fire with nothing but trunks and dive masks were ghosts, silent, unseen heroes.
and that was fine with them. Their job had never been to be seen. Their job had been to do the impossible. But peace brought its own confusion. The Navy didn't know what to do with the UDTs now that amphibious invasions were no longer urgent. Some officers believed the teams should be dissolved entirely. Others argued that their skills were too valuable to lose. In the end, a compromise emerged. The UDTs would remain, a lean, specialized force, kept alive for future conflicts. But the transition to peacetime was not easy. Some men left immediately, going home to farms, workshops, shipyards, and small towns where no one had any idea what they had done. A few stayed in the Navy, serving as instructors for new divers. Others drifted, haunted by memories of explosions underwater, the sting of coral in open wounds, the sight of friends drifting lifeless in red-stained surf. Yet even in peacetime, the world was shifting again. In 1950, war erupted on the Korean Peninsula. The UDTs were called back into action, not for massive amphibious assaults like the Pacific War, but for covert raids, underwater demolitions, sabotage, reconnaissance, and river operations that required even more stealth and precision than before. One of their most famous operations took place during the Incheon landings in September 1950. Incheon was a tidal nightmare. Mudflats, extreme tidal shifts, narrow channels, and fortified seawalls. General Douglas MacArthur's daring plan depended entirely on a precise understanding of the underwater terrain.
Once again, the UDTs were asked to do what seemed impossible. Lieutenant Commander E.L. Bud Atkinson led a group of swimmers into the waters around Incheon. They swam through filth, oil, and the stench of war, marking channels and identifying hazards. Later, UDT men used massive charges to blast holes in the seawall itself, enabling Marines to scale it more easily when the invasion began. When the landing craft surged toward the shore, guided by UDT markers, MacArthur's gamble paid off. The landing was a success, and once again the demolition men had played a decisive but invisible role. But their work in Korea didn't end with Incheon. UDTs infiltrated enemy-held harbors, conducted demolition raids on railroad tunnels and bridges, and rescued downed pilots from behind enemy lines. In one mission, UDT-1 performed a covert reconnaissance of Wonsan Harbor, swimming through freezing water in darkness, avoiding tripwires, mines, and Soviet-supplied patrol craft. Their intelligence proved crucial for the subsequent amphibious landing. They also developed new equipment, rubber fins, better masks, waterproof radios, compact explosives, and improved combat swimming techniques. Many of the tactics that would one day define the SEALs, stealth landings, covert intelligence gathering, nighttime raids, began with these Korean War missions. Yet something else was happening behind the scenes. The world had entered the Cold War, a shadow conflict filled with covert operations, espionage, and proxy battles. The United States suddenly needed a new type of warrior, one not just skilled in demolition, but capable of clandestine missions, counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare, and deep reconnaissance. President John F. Kennedy championed the idea of unconventional warfare units, elite teams capable of operating in jungles, rivers, swamps, coasts, deltas, and hostile shores anywhere in the world. And from this need, a natural evolution occurred. The underwater demolition teams became the foundation, the genetic blueprint for something new. Men like Draper Kaufman, Bud Atkinson, and Phil Bucklew, the father of Naval Special Warfare, began shaping the doctrine for these new units. Bucklew had already proven himself in WWII in ways few Americans ever learned, conducting covert intelligence missions along the beaches of Normandy, before D-Day, disguised as a civilian fisherman, gathering data at night, slipping away before German patrols could capture him. His personal courage, combined with the underwater mission of the UDTs, created the perfect fusion for modern maritime special operations. In 1961, Kennedy formally directed the Navy to create two new units, SEAL Team 1 on the West Coast and SEAL Team 2 on the East Coast. Many of the first SEALs were drawn directly from the ranks of the UDTs, men hardened by years of swimming under fire, men who had stared death in the face from Saipan to Okinawa and chosen to swim forward anyway. They brought with them the discipline of the pioneers, Draper Kaufman's relentless training, the lessons learned in blood at Iwo Jima, the courage forged in the surf zones of the Pacific. They trained in hand-to-hand combat, parachuting, diving, demolitions, small arms, and guerrilla warfare. They studied languages, survival, intelligence, and unconventional tactics. They became something more than divers, more than swimmers, more than demolition men. They became America's maritime commandos. But the legacy of the UDTs never faded. Even as SEAL teams took on global missions, the demolition men remained active, continuing to handle hydrographic reconnaissance, mine clearance, and underwater demolition tasks. And in the jungles of Vietnam, both UDTs and SEALs would operate side by side. The Vietnam War was unlike anything the UDT pioneers had faced. Instead of storming beaches under artillery fire, they now swam through murky rivers, booby-trapped deltas, and dense mangrove swamps. They conducted ambushes, gathered intelligence, captured enemy officers, and rescued American prisoners. One of the most legendary operations came from SEAL Team 1's Lieutenant Tom Norris, who later rescued 2 downed pilots deep behind enemy lines. He would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. Meanwhile, the UDTs conducted extensive mine-clearing operations in the Mekong Delta and carried out sabotage missions against North Vietnamese infrastructure. Bit by bit, the world began to understand that the Navy's swimmers were far more than demolition specialists. They were elite warriors capable of operating in any environment. And still, the roots of everything they did traced back to the beaches of the Pacific, to the first men who swam into machine gun fire with no weapons, to the wooden stakes they hammered into coral, to the hand-drawn charts soaked in seawater, to the silent sacrifices that saved thousands of Marines and sailors. When the war in Vietnam ended and the UDTs transitioned fully into the SEAL teams in 1983, the legacy of the original demolition men became the foundation of Naval Special Warfare. Their ethos, quiet professionalism, precision, courage under fire, became the DNA of the modern SEAL. The world knew the SEALs for their daring missions: Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless operations still classified. But beneath the surface of every modern mission lived the ghosts of the Pacific, the men who swam at Saipan, the men who bled at Iwo Jima, the men who defied death in the waters of Okinawa. And as the decades passed, historians began uncovering the stories of the naked warriors, the original UDT swimmers, who had gone almost unrecognized after WWII. Museums dedicated exhibits to them, documentaries honored them. Surviving members were invited to speak, often reluctantly, because humility had long been part of their character. Many refused to call themselves heroes. "We just did our job," they would say. "We just went in first." They never sought glory, they only sought victory and survival. And though time aged their bodies, their memories remained razor-sharp, a testament to the intensity of the missions they endured. They remembered the sound of bullets slicing into water, the sting of coral, the weight of a comrade's lifeless arm, the cold fear of diving beneath surf while artillery thundered overhead, and the pride of knowing that because of their work, thousands of young Marines and sailors made it home alive. As modern SEALs carried out missions across the world, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the coastlines of Africa, they often spoke of their predecessors with reverence. The UDT men were the ones who taught the Navy how to fight in the ocean, how to infiltrate from the sea, how to conduct reconnaissance under impossible conditions. Without them, there would be no special warfare community, no SEAL ethos, no maritime commandos. Their legacy was carved into history with salt water, sweat, courage, and blood. And as long as the sea exists, untamed, unpredictable, unforgiving, the story of the underwater demolition teams will live on, carried by every swimmer who steps into the surf knowing that danger lies ahead and goes forward anyway.
In the years that followed the full integration of UDT units into Naval Special Warfare, the ghosts of the original demolition swimmers still walked silently beside every new recruit who arrived at Coronado. The loud instructors, the endless surf torture, the sand-filled boots, the cold Pacific mornings, none of these were random inventions of modern training. They were echoes, carefully preserved rituals born from real lessons in the Pacific, reflections of what men like Draper Kaufman, Bill Atkinson, Frank Kelso, and Phil Bucklew had discovered the hard way, that the ocean was the first enemy and the mind was the last battlefield. Recruits who arrived for basic underwater demolition SEAL training often saw photographs of wartime UDT operators, lean, sunburned, wearing nothing but trunks and a knife. They didn't realize that these images were more than nostalgia. They were reminders of the purity and brutality at the heart of the job. Whenever an instructor shouted, "The only easy day was yesterday," he was quoting the unspoken law that governed the original swimmers. Those men had no armor, no rifles, no guarantees. Only the cold water, the mission, and each other. Naval Special Warfare evolved rapidly as the world changed. By the late 20th century, SEAL teams were developing advanced diving gear, closed-circuit rebreathers, night vision, underwater propulsion systems, and specialized weapons. Yet even the most cutting-edge equipment felt strangely insignificant compared to what the UDTs once did, with just a mask, a slate, and sheer will. During the Cold War, SEALs carried out classified operations across the globe, intelligence gathering in the Baltics, reconnaissance missions in Southeast Asia, shipboarding operations in the Persian Gulf. And in each new challenge, commanders often reference the traditions of the demolition swimmers: adapt, improvise, endure. When special warfare units were reorganized into Naval Special Warfare groups, instructors reinstated a long-abandoned tradition, teaching new candidates about the early UDT operations in the Pacific, emphasizing the emotion as much as the technique. Veterans from Saipan and Okinawa occasionally visited Coronado. Some were in wheelchairs, some walked with canes, some had ears damaged by underwater blasts decades before. When they spoke, the room always fell silent. One elderly UDT man named Joseph Red Haynes addressed a class of trainees by lifting his shaking hands in front of them. "These hands once held the line," he said. "Not a rifle, a string, a line that told the Marines where to land, a line that saved lives. If you're going to wear this trident one day, you better be ready to carry a line like that." Many candidates later said it was the moment they truly understood what being a Navy special operator meant. By the 1990s, the nature of war shifted again. Instead of nation-against-nation conflicts, the world saw asymmetric warfare, terrorist networks, hidden cells, and non-state threats that operated in shadows. The ocean, once the front line between fleets, became a covert highway for infiltration and extraction. SEAL teams adapted quickly, drawing heavily from UDT infiltration principles: quiet, efficient, unseen. The maritime domain surged back into importance. When conflicts erupted in the Middle East, SEALs executed beach reconnaissance, underwater demolitions, clandestine surveillance, and direct action missions, echoes of tasks pioneered by Kaufman's men half a century earlier. During the Gulf War in 1991, SEAL operators were tasked with creating a diversion to mislead Iraqi forces into believing a major amphibious landing was imminent. They slipped silently toward Kuwait's shoreline, placing explosives on the sand, while aircraft launched decoy attacks. When the charges detonated, the explosions lit up the night and caused Iraqi commanders to divert entire divisions to the coast, away from the real attack routes.
It was a psychological operation reminiscent of the strategic beach preparations of the Pacific campaigns. SEAL team missions in Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s further expanded the community's role.
Hostage rescues, raids on insurgent compounds, intelligence gathering, and high-valued target operations, all built upon principles learned long ago. Know the terrain, move unseen, strike precisely, vanish completely. Still, the Pacific legacy endured. Many modern SEALs visiting the UDT SEAL Museum in Fort Pierce felt humbled when standing before the reconstructed mock-ups of Saipan and Iwo Jima beaches. They saw the primitive gear, the Mk2 demolition chargers, the grease pencils, the canvas belts, the wooden stakes. They could not imagine swimming toward machine gun fire wearing only those. Retired SEAL commanders often pointed to those displays and said, "Remember this, these men ran so you could sprint." And in the quiet corners of the museum, a bronze statue of a lone UDT swimmer stood, mask in hand, chest bare, muscles tense, as if forever preparing for another mission in the surf. Each year, active duty SEALs held ceremonies honoring the original demolition men. Bells tolled for those who had fallen. Wreaths were laid in the water. It was a tradition dating back to the Pacific. After each fatal mission, swimmers would gather at dusk, form a silent circle, and let a wreath drift into the sea. No speeches, no prayers, only the sound of waves. The modern ceremonies were the same. The silence, too, was the same. By the time the global war on terror reached its most intense years, SEAL teams had become renowned worldwide. Their missions were legendary, many still classified. But one in particular marked a moment in modern warfare that would echo through history: Operation Neptune Spear, the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in 2011. The Navy chose the operation's code name deliberately: Neptune, the god of the sea. A tribute to the community that had been born from the ocean surf, a nod to the demolition men who once crawled through broken coral under mortar fire. And when the SEALs executed the mission with surgical precision, each step reflected the legacy of those early lessons: reconnaissance, stealth, coordinated movement, decisive action. Though the raid occurred far from any beach, the spirit of the UDTs was present in every moment. Yet even with global recognition, the ethos of the demolition swimmers remained unchanged: quiet professionalism. Many SEALs refused interviews. Others shunned Hollywood portrayals. They believed the real story was not about single missions, but about the long chain of sacrifice stretching back to 1943. A chain forged in the surf of Waimanalo and the waters of Normandy, strengthened in the coral of the Marianas, hardened at Iwo Jima, and sealed in the volcanic ash of Okinawa. Modern trainees felt that history pressing against them each time they ran into the freezing waves during Hell Week. They knew that instructors weren't merely testing endurance, they were echoing the crucible that had shaped their predecessors. During drown-proofing drills, they remembered stories of UDT men tying ropes around themselves so they wouldn't drift while sketching enemy obstacles in the dark. During timed underwater knot tying, they imagined the panic those original swimmers must have felt while laying explosives under fire. During long-distance ocean swims, they pictured Saipan's purple reefs and Tinian's deadly shallows. And during the coldest nights, wrapped in wet uniforms, shaking uncontrollably, they remembered that the UDTs had no wetsuits at all. Some candidates quit. Many failed. But those who stayed understood that they were carrying a torch lit in a different century. In 2016, surviving UDT veterans, men now in their late 80s and early 90s, attended a ceremony at Coronado. Hundreds of SEALs, active and retired, stood at attention. Many young operators whispered among themselves, recognizing names they had only ever read in history books. When a frail Frank Boots kinsman, one of the swimmers from Iwo Jima, was rolled forward in a wheelchair, the entire formation snapped to a sharper posture. He raised one trembling hand and grinned. "You boys have better gear, but the water's just as cold." Laughter broke the tension. But every man there knew the deeper truth that everything they had, everything they were, everything they represented existed because of men like him. Before the ceremony ended, a younger SEAL stepped forward carrying a faded UDT patch discovered in a forgotten footlocker. He placed it in Kinsman's hands. The old man stared at it for a long moment. Then, with surprising strength, he lifted it high and said, "Take it forward." It was not just a gesture, it was a passing of the torch, a promise, a command. And modern SEALs obeyed it. As naval special warfare continued into the 21st century, they expanded capabilities into cyber operations, unmanned reconnaissance vehicles, aerial insertion methods, and advanced underwater drones. Yet through all the innovation, the community never abandoned its core, the fusion of land, sea, and intelligence operations born from UDT roots. In every briefing room, instructors still told new candidates the same truth. The modern SEAL stands on the shoulders of the naked warriors, the ones who swam first, the ones who drew the first charts in hostile waters, the ones who crawled through surf with charges strapped to their chests, the ones who set the standard not with words, but with endurance, precision, and silent courage. And as long as SEALs continued to operate across the globe, stepping onto hostile shores, swimming beneath moonlit waves, or infiltrating enemy strongholds at dawn, the ghosts of those first demolition men will always be with them, watching, guiding, reminding, because the sea never forgets the footsteps of those who dared to enter its depths, carrying nothing but hope, bravery, and the promise to clear the way for others.